Right, greetings. Hello, it's Dr. Thomas Daffern here. It's my weekly Sunday fast for peace. I've been inspired by the Gandhian tradition. Fasting is very important, and I recommend it one day a week at least to focus the mind on spiritual matters, things that really matter in life. And I've been doing this now for 2 years, each week on a Sunday. It's my time for reflection, for thinking, and I usually record some kind of a talk. When I lived at the Castle of the Muses in Scotland, every Sunday we'd have a service. I would do a kind of a sermon. So in a sense, it's my sermons. So it's been quite a week, and I'm recording this on the 12th of September. It's the day after the anniversary of 9/11, which means a lot to me. I love New York. I know people who had friends who died in those tragic events. To me it's still an unsolved mystery. It triggered the invasion of Afghanistan by the West, and then all kinds of catastrophes have followed since. I'm going to address these issues in this talk. This is quite an important talk, therefore. And I have had many Afghan friends in my life, many students, and I have a deep love of Afghan culture. And why on earth did they have a 20-year chaos and meltdown? Why did the West pump in $6 trillion, which is the figure if you include the interest payments, to replace the Taliban with the Taliban? It makes no sense at all. In my view, as an educator and a peace scholar, if we'd have pumped in $100,000 into the University of Kabul to run courses for Islamists, scholars working on the hermeneutic of the Quran. What is this Quran? How should we understand it? How should we apply it to law? What is Sharia law? What kinds of subtleties and nuances are there? Is this Salafist school the only one? Is that the most intelligent form of Islamic law? If we'd have got debate like that going at the University of Kabul, and it wouldn't have cost anywhere near what it cost to destroy the country again and again, we could have got some sort of consensus in the Afghan community among their intellectuals, because they are a very, very intelligent people. Some of my Afghan students have been the cleverest people I've ever had the pleasure to teach. And to me, it's an insult. And it shows more about the dumbing down of America and American policy, that was the best way they could think of to deal with 9/11. Invade the country, bomb it, and anyway, we'll come back to that. So 20 years of nonsense has been going on. I feel like I've been watching like a really third-rate B-movie Hollywood soap opera. And it just, to me, indicates the unintelligence of both Britain and America and our response to the difficulties in the Islamic world and their confrontation with modernity and what kind of Islam is to emerge out of all this. So I'm going to be addressing all these complex issues here as a philosopher and historian. I want to start with a report on a couple of events I've attended since I last spoke at the Belfer Seminar in Harvard University. It's an online Zoom conference I attended. And they're, really, really interesting high-level discourse. The first one was about Afghanistan. And it was a 20-year, reflection by some of the people that were instrumental and key in forging American policy on Afghanistan. I listened with great attention and took lots of notes and discussion, participation. I asked a couple of questions. They weren't allowed, or there wasn't room for them. Obviously, lots of people were listening in on Zoom. It was a very, very high-level meeting, and there was a lot of discussion about, what the West could have done differently, what could an American response have been. And one comment was, why were there no Afghans talking? There weren't. It was all Western, intelligence and academic and policy specialists. There was no no Afghan presence there. Anyway, I learned a lot. Sue Gordon spoke she is a former, very high level in the CIA, but she's also interested in policy and ideas and academia. and this was a meeting, an academic meeting on the record. It wasn't an intelligence meeting. And she, I don't felt that she really understood or grasped the implications of this 20-year debacle. She still is defending American policy. I don't think that's defensible. I think her position, Sue Gordon, and people that trot out the old line, well, we did our best, what else could we do? Now, I think they could have done something more, and I think one of the problems that this seminar shows is, what do you do with a so-called intelligence service that is actually not very intelligent? I mean, I'm not saying there aren't individual geniuses in the CIA and in American intelligence, but, sampling what I've been looking at, I would say the level is not as high as it ought to be to get really finessed and really intelligent policies. And it immediately reaches for a military option. What I think the problem with both American and British intelligence in our response to Islamic terrorism, to use that term, which is a fact, it does exist, is that we've always reached for the military solution first and foremost. And I think that's been a mistake. I think this 20-year war in Afghanistan should have shown that you cannot defeat things like the Taliban with purely military escapades. And of course, the fact that Bush only was serious about the Afghan war for the first few months, actually, and then he immediately invaded Iraq. Now, one of the guys on there who's quite intelligent, Rolf, who is a former CIA leader in actually the Russian desk, interesting enough, Rolf Mowat Larsen. I would say he's one of the more intelligent of the CIA thinkers that I've seen. And he actually said, look, the invasion of Iraq was wrong. Obviously, these people are all speaking just for themselves. They're not giving, this is the official policy of the CIA. And that is itself interesting, because this question that you have to speak for your individual self, but you can't speak for an organisation. I think we need to revisit that red line. One of the issues that came up again and again in the Belfast Seminar was this question of red lines. Apparently in American intelligence circles, there is this concept that intelligence officers are never allowed to comment on policy. And all they can do is give operational substance to policies that have been set by the politicians. I find that perplexing and slightly disingenuous. I mean, that's how to create ridiculous policies. Because what's the point of intelligence people giving any information to politicians if they're never allowed to comment on the policies they formulate as a result of them? If I'm an intelligence officer and I tell the president, look, this policy you're thinking of is contraindicated by this, and this, and this. If you do it, it's going to lead to a catastrophe, and the consequences will be this, and this. And the president turns around and says, well, I don't give a damn, I'm going to do it anyway. And then this, and this, all the things you predicted happen. I think one has a duty as an intelligence officer to speak truth to power, to be able to say to the president, actually, invading a sovereign country like Iraq is going to lose us more friends and allies throughout the Middle East than any amount of any other policy you could possibly do. It's the most catastrophic, the most stupid, the most ignorant response to a situation with bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, that has nothing to do with Iraq. You confuse the issues. You've suddenly said, oh, I tell you what, look, chaos in the world, 9/11, towers down, war against evil. Let's use the opportunity to invade Iraq, shall we? I mean, somebody in the CIA should have stood up to the president and said, Mr. Bush, have you lost your mind? This is contraindicated by every single possible norm of international law, of ethics, of statecraft, and of geopolitics. This is going to lose America hegemony long term. It'll make us a laughingstock. Now, I can't believe that people like Ralph Mowat and all the others were not intelligent enough to realise that. Surely they knew that. In which case, why didn't they have the courage to say that to the president? Because there's a red line, you're not allowed to critique presidential policy. Well, I think that's completely and utterly absurd. What's the point of having intelligence if you muzzle them and don't let them actually speak their truths? So that's the first point. And there was some little chat on this very interesting conference. I hope they publish the result, the transcript. I don't know that they have an academic journal for their intelligence project. I hope so. If they publish it, the transcript will show there was a bit of back chat that, yes, maybe there shouldn't be such a thick red line. Maybe intelligence experts should be able to critique policy. That relates to the question of what you do with a very unintelligent president. Let's fast forward to Trump, who was making up policy on a whim and God knows what. The least intelligent president I think I've ever lived through. And that's saying something, because Gerald Ford wasn't exactly a genius. And yet, was intelligence not able to say anything or do anything? So I think there was an agreement at this conference eventually, in the end, that actually maybe there should be a bit more of a conversation. In other words, intelligence actually has a duty to make the presidential policies intelligent. Anyway, that was part of the discussion. And it was a fascinating conference. There was a chap called Norman Rule also speaking, who goes back a long way in shaping American policy on Afghanistan. And there was a chap called Kevin Ryan. And, it was all very much about, what could we have done it better? Could we have got bin Laden quicker? Could we have, et cetera, et cetera. Then he came to a chap called Jeff Fields, who is a FBI officer. Again, he was speaking just as an individual, not on the record for his organisation. And he, I think, was the cleverest guy in the room, actually. Jeff Fields, a black guy, African-American, quite high up in the FBI, I think, who was involved in fighting Al-Qaeda from the ground, as a field officer in New York and places, because they knew that Islamic terrorism was infiltrating America. So he was one of the guys charged with, smoking them out and exposing them. And so when he was asked, well, what would you have done differently? What could you have done more? He said very wisely, let's go back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, shall we? In other words, he was setting it within the context of big history. He was saying, and he's obviously an intellectual, this guy, Jeff Fields, he was saying, look, the chaos of Afghanistan, the chaos of 9/11, the chaos of Taliban, they have deeper antecedent causes. And if we're going to try and, learn the lessons of history, which is this conference was about, learning the lessons of the last 20 years, the lessons have to be learned even before that. Because, in a sense, the minute 9/11 happened, it was too late. That was... The lessons had not been learned. That was our failure as a planet, our failure as America, failure as the West, failure as Britain. I took that event personally, 9/11. I'd spent the previous 20 years working non-stop for peace, coordinating philosophers of peace, and suddenly that happened. It was like, a complete annihilation of everything I believed in. Interfaith peace, interfaith dialogue, the possibility of Middle East peace, possibility Jews, Christians and Muslims can live together in harmony, possibility that Afghans and Shias and Sunnis and Indians and Hindus and Sikhs and Buddhists, that we can all work out a sort of peace vision for the planet as a whole, that we can divest from militarism and put it into peace work and education. All that was just... pulverised all my dreams. And the fact that a Labour Prime Minister in Britain was endorsing the immediate militarisation of the world as the response, saying, the answer, it was Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, let's declare war on the Middle East, let's have a war against evil. Somebody in this conference did point out the absurdity of that, because it's mission creep. It began as a let's get bin Laden, he did 9/11. Then it became, let's get all Islamic terrorists, and then it became, well, let's just get evil. Those are, and that shows the ignorance of Bush, really. He had, serious deficit of intelligence. Anyway, that's a brief summary of what was a very fascinating, riveting conference which I attended. And, okay, the next day, as if that wasn't exciting enough, right, or on the 10th of September, there was a second conference, also organised by the Belfer Institute, which I also was able to attend, which was even more high level, even more interesting in some ways, because it concerned 9/11 itself. It was the Belfer Centre for Intelligence Studies, which is part of the JFK Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. I've been there, I've visited, sat in the library. I mean, most people don't know that Kennedy was a lecturer at Harvard. Kennedy was one of my boyhood heroes when I was a young boy, growing up in a progressive climate in Brighton and Kemp Town, and we were so happy there was a decent president in America. We'd just come back from Canada as a family. We were transatlantic. A lot of my friends were growing up in Brighton. One of my close friends, a guy called Jason Cunliffe, his dad taught American Studies at the University of Sussex. And so we were happy Kennedy was in charge, and utterly mortified when he was assassinated. Utterly mortified. And, he was obviously assassinated by a conspiracy of ignorance. And that is what has annoyed me ever since, growing up in the wake of that assassination. So who did it? What was doing it? Well, that's why also 9/11 annoys me so much. I love New York. I've spent time in New York. I've fallen in love in New York. I've been to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. I've spent time in the Butler Library at Columbia University. I've lectured at the UN headquarters given a talk at, as part of the International Association of University Presidents Commission on Peace and Disarmament Studies in Universities. I've been honoured to be twice invited to present to that forum, and with my old friend Leyland Miles. I know New York, it's my other city. I was born up the road in Montreal. So when it happened, I was utterly, utterly mortified. And my immediate response was to suspend judgment. I'm a trained philosopher and historian. I don't jump to conclusions. And when immediately it started to be announced on the media, like within a few hours actually it seemed, or a couple of days, that, this was Al-Qaeda, this was Bin Laden, I got suspicious. I thought, how can they possibly know that? That's too soon. Where's the forensic evidence? Where's the actual proof of that? And I was waiting for that proof, but it never came. What we had was a barrage of media declarations that this was the case. And I got suspicious. I mean, I kind of accepted it because, well, what can you do? That's what they're trumpeting all the time. Then we organised a conference in November that year at St Daniel's Library in Harden in Wales. And it was the house where Gladstone developed his library. He had a huge library. I have to say, with chagrin, even bigger than mine. Mine's only 12,000 books. I think he had about 20,000 at the end. And he bequeathed them all to the nation. And it's now the St Daniel's Library. You can go and visit and study there. It's a paradise. It's like my idea of the Heavenly Library. And Gladstone was a very great man. He was a liberal. He was an intellectual. He would not have just jumped to conclusions, if he'd been around at 9/11. Let's say Gladstone had been Prime Minister instead of Tony Blair. No way would he have gone to war without actual proof that this was Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Anyway, what was so interesting at the Belfast Seminar on 9/11, it was a day-long thing, I attended the whole thing, was we were there with some of the major actors who'd been helping shape American policy in response. And the keynote address, the first one that was given by a guy called Philip Zellikow, who some of you may remember was the executive director of the Commission of Inquiry set up by Bush in the wake of 9/11. He at first resisted setting it up. He fought against it. He didn't want to set one up. It's like he wanted to suppress the whole thing. And that comes out of Michael Moore's film, Fahrenheit 9/11, which he also broadcast yesterday for those that saw it again. Anyway, Philip Zellikow is a clever chap. He's an intellectual. He's a historian. He's now a professor of history. And he edited the thing. So his words carry some weight. And he gave a masterly little lecture about what we can learn from 9/11. And he has pointed to two things. Firstly, the paradox prevention, which he says, again, he was focusing on how we could have stopped 9/11 beforehand. And he says the only way we could have stopped it was if more resources had gone to the counterintelligence who were fighting Al-Qaeda at the time. He says, no, there was a lot of people working on Al-Qaeda. There were CIA mainly, but also FBI, all kinds of groups active in that. And if only some extra resources, men, money, equipment, had been given them, they could have stopped it. They could have got bin Laden and prevented it happening. So that was the thrust. He calls that the paradox of prevention. The problem is that, it's very difficult to get support for this until the disasters happened. After the disaster of 9/11, suddenly everyone pours money into the intelligence budget. CIA would never get fourfold budget increase overnight and hire new staff and all that. The paradox of prevention is that you need the money up front beforehand to prevent something. And nobody's interested in funding prevention work. What they're interested in is funding the go-get-em afterwards work. It's an important point. I would take it a bit further. I would say that if Zellikow ever listens to my talk here, and I hope he does, the paradox of deep prevention is that we should prevent the conflict breaking out in the first place. We should be investing in peace studies, in reconciliation work, in peace history. We should have been having conferences of Afghan historians and American and British and French historians like the 20 years before 9/11, trying to get common consensus on, well, what's the map in the Quran for peace? What's the map in the Jewish Bible? What's the map in the Christian Bible? What's the map in secular modernist historiography? Can we get some reconciliation here? We should have been doing our peace thinking to prevent these nightmares. That's what I was doing in my PhD at the time. But I was only one of a handful of peace historians. Peter van den Dungen at Bradford is another. Whereas money was, from our perspective, money was being poured into not actual prevention, but exacerbation funding. Because after all, let's face it, it was British and American intelligence that funded Al-Qaeda's beginning and sponsored with Arabian money, but it was our expertise that funded the rise of Al-Qaeda as a weapon to defeat the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And that's funding exacerbation. We deliberately stirred up a hornet's nest in Afghanistan, training up the Mujahideen to become valiant warriors against the Soviet system because of our own Cold War policies. Now, I would have prevented it right there and then. I wouldn't have permitted that. I would have stayed neutral on the Afghan question. I would have offered to mediate. And that's what I was doing as part of the European nuclear disarmament. We were having meetings in London on the Afghan situation in the early 80s, soon after the Soviet invasion of 79. And whereas what the West did is it exacerbated the situation. It trained up Mujahideen, it trained up bin Laden, it gave them skills to blow stuff up. And then, 9/11 doesn't come out of the blue. It comes out of this joined up consequence of logical and ethical dilemmas. But of course, Zellikow doesn't say any of this. He like so many traditional academic historians, he's rooted to his own little blinkers. And, sorry to have to say this, but I've known quite a few historians who are like that. They're specialists in their one thing. I mean, he ought to know better because if he's going to start talking about the paradox of prevention, you have to start with conflict resolution and peace studies. And if we're in the same business, which I hope we are, my job is to prevent wars and solve them if they break out. I hope that's Zellikow's mission, in which case let's have a conversation about the paradox of prevention. Then he talked later about the paradox of adjustment. And he said that, adjusting to new realities as they come about after, say, 9/11 is a problem because you want to go in there gung-ho fighting, but maybe that's not the best policy. Also, what about failure? How do you adjust to failure? Now we've got 20 years replacing Taliban with Taliban. How are the American intelligence superstate actors going to adjust to this? Well, are they going to just carry on warfare and do drone warfare and keep killing Taliban types? Or are they going to actually sit down and say, this whole story, we got it wrong. actually, let's support Thomas Daffon's Commission of Inquiry into the history of 9/11. We don't really know it was Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. We don't absolutely certainly know that, do we? Why don't we support that amazing International Historical Commission of Inquiry into 9/11, and let's actually find the truth out about what happened. Let's invite the great Afghan historians from the University of Kabul and the diaspora to sit on the commission. Let's have the 10 leading American historians on it. Look, we can have Zellikow as well. Let's invite the top 10 British historians, and the French and the German and the Dutch and the Japanese and the Greek, and every single UNESCO country could send their top historian. We can meet up in Paris at UNESCO and have this commission and suspend judgment till we know for absolute certain who did 9/11. You see, what annoys me is that Bin Laden was sentenced in the court of public opinion, even though he was saying he had nothing to do with it. And then he was hounded to death finally and, killed at Abbottabad, one believes. He may not have had anything to do with 9/11. It is possible. I'm sorry to have to bring you that bad news. But it is possible. And if you can prove to me 100% contrary-wise, as chair of the 9/11 Historical Commission, then please send me the evidence in email or in the post. If you have a signed letter by Bin Laden saying, no, I did 9/11, send it to me. I will look at the evidence. But meanwhile, I suspend judgment. Anyway, so Zellikow did his thing. He spoke about, very well. Then we had John Farmer speaking, who was another intelligence operative. And then Michael Morrell. Now, I'd not heard from him before. Interesting, clever chap. He grew to be deputy director of the CIA. And he was actually with Bush, advising him about intelligence matters on a daily basis in the run-up to and during and after 9/11. I think he served under 3 presidents, but W. Bush was one of them. And he was actually in the Florida, school where the Bush president heard about the attacks. Now that was very interesting. And he was later with him on Air Force One when he took off into the air for security, and all the gripping events of that day that the narrative tells us. So what did Michael Morrell have to say? Well, this was really interesting. Michael Morrell had been a senior CIA operative on the Al-Qaeda project in the months leading up to 9/11, and he'd been jumping up and down trying to find out, or this is what he claims anyway, where was Bin Laden, what was he up to, what were Al-Qaeda doing? And he was trying to get this thing flagged up as a matter of supreme importance. Now, there is evidence that the CIA knew that Bin Laden represented a threat, and that there had been attempts to put this in a report briefing to the president. And the president sort of brushed it off and not bothered to look at it. What we learned from Michael Moore's film is he spent most of August on his ranch driving around in his Jeep and pretending to be a normal Texan kind of guy and playing golf and going boating. In other words, not doing any work at all in the months leading up to 9/11. And this is shocking, and thank you, Michael Moore, for getting that footage together. Well, what was Michael Morrell doing at that time? Why wasn't he, making the president sit down and saying, look, George, stop taking the cocaine, read this report? I don't know. I mean, the trouble is you only get, each speaker got 20 minutes and then a couple of questions. I'd love to have a half-a-day chat with Michael Morrell. And again, if you ever get to listen to this talk, and I hope you do, give us an email, let's have a chat. Why didn't you, if you knew that Bin Laden was really that much of a threat, if American intelligence really knew that, why on earth didn't you insist that this novice president, who had obviously a sort of attention deficit disorder of some kind, didn't actually sit? Now, again, is it because you're not allowed to interfere in policy? Is there a myth that the intelligence operative can only just sort of say, well, actually, if you want to read it, here's the report, but can't insist? Well, if so, no wonder America is in the state it's in, because that is just stupid. I mean, I can't believe in George Washington's day, if someone got wind of a British attack coming up the Potomac or wherever, they wouldn't have burst into where Washington was at a meal and saying, George, come, the British Army are on their way. They're 20 miles downstream. Do something. You know, intelligence that is meant to be acted on immediately is meant to be acted on immediately. That's how it goes. And as a historian of intelligence in my own little way, you know, I've studied this matter at some detail, going right back to in the days of Caesar and Alexander the Great, and you know, wars are won with intelligence. That's how Britain won World War II, was with enigma. You know, Britain won World War II. I mean, was part of the Allied team that defeated the fascist Nazi Axis powers, and couldn't have done it alone. But certainly our cracking of enigma really, really helped. So I know the importance of intelligence, and Christopher Andrews, who's the greatest British historian of intelligence, was at this conference. I'm coming to his speech in a minute. It was incredibly important. Let me finish with Michael Morrell first. A clever chap. But what I learned, and this was really, really interesting, is that it was Michael Morrell who said, when Bush kind of looked at him as he saw the TV monitor showing the planes going in, and he'd finally been extracted from the reading the pet goat thing, and he was actually like, you know, talking to Michael, and he asked Michael, who do you think did this? Michael Morrell says, and he said at this meeting, he had a gut feeling, an instinctive feeling immediately that this was Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. And he told the president, he said, I think this is Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. Now, you know, if that's true, and I you know, one assumes these people are speaking truthfully. They're not speaking like in a court of law under oath, but they're decent human beings actually telling the truth to a conference of academic peers. Then it's very interesting, because it means that Michael Morrell it was who made that decision that this was a work by bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Now, why did he make that decision? Well, according to his talk, it was because he just spent the last year or two studying that matter in great detail. It was on his brain. You know, he knew that bin Laden was a real threat. There'd been several attacks on American, you know, in the embassy in East Africa, and on the coal shipped off, you know, in the Gulf, and other things. And bin Laden had claimed responsibility. So they knew that bin Laden was gone rogue long since the days when he actually worked for the CIA against the common enemy of the Soviets. No, bin Laden had gone rogue. They knew that. And so they had been monitoring him very carefully. And so Michael Morrell had been part of that team. I'm not sure in what capacity or what level of oversight, but given that he was very senior in the CIA, enough to be the right-hand man of Bush, you know, I'm not sure why he hadn't been able to, you know, bring the matter to the president's attention. Anyway, he sort of made up for it after 9/11, because he said immediately, that's bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And I think he planted the seed thought into Bush's mind that that was the truth. Now, I don't know the basis. I don't think Michael Morrell, if I were interviewing him, and I hope to chat to him at some point, I don't think he could say on God's truth, you know, Scout's honour, I knew for certain it was bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. I think he had an instinctive feeling it was. He put that together with his, he called it a hunch at the meeting. With all, you know, he knew this guy was out to get the West. He knew there'd been warnings, presumably, that they were about to hit. And so then, you know, pennies start dropping, and he says, who did this to Bush? He says, well, it was Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. But I don't think at that point he had the authority to say that. What he should have said, a good intelligence agent would say, there is some evidence it might have been Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. It might have been someone else too. We need to investigate this, sir. That's what a really top-notch, good, dare I say, a British agent would have said. I don't know why on earth, you know, but Morrell didn't say that, apparently.